Representative Premila Jayapal represents Washington's 7th Congressional District, my home district. She immigrated to the U.S. alone at age 16. After the September 11th attacks and in the wake of discrimination against Muslims, Arabs, and South Asians, she founded the nonprofit Hate Free Zone, now called One America. She served as executive director for 11 years, growing the organization to the largest immigrant advocacy organization in Washington state and one of the largest in the country. She spent more than 20 years leading organizing and advocacy efforts for women's and immigrant rights. Elected in 2016 after being on this stage, I'll just note, she's the first Indian American woman in the House of Representatives. And what's she doing up there? She is co-chair of Congressional Progressive Caucus and serves on the Judiciary, Budget, and Education and Labor Committees. She lives in the Seattle area here with her family and their dog Otis. Right? Congresswoman Kim Schrier represents Washington's 8th Congressional District, which includes much of King, Pierce, Kittitas, and Chelan counties, and portions of Douglas County. Prior to being elected to Congress in 2018, Representative Schrier spent her career as a pediatrician in Issaquah, working with children across the Puget Sound region and helping families navigate the healthcare system. In Congress, she uses this expertise to inform her work on issues that improve the lives, health, and well-being of children, as the only woman doctor in Congress. She understands the very real fear of healthcare costs and access for people living with pre-existing conditions, and has worked in a broken healthcare system as a physician. So she understands what charges need to be made, what changes need to be made to make it work better for patients and providers. So she lives in Sammamish with her husband David and son Sam. We'd like to welcome Washington State folks and our representatives. Thank you both. And now I'll hand it over to Larry and Joni. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, David. We're really excited that we have the two congresswomen here tonight. Have such an enthusiastic audience. I just wanted to make an obligatory statement here, and that is Seattle University does not support or oppose the positions of the speakers. The views expressed are those of the speakers only.
So
okay, we got that over with.
So there.
We'd also like to say that we did invite all of the female members of the House from Washington, all 5 of them. Susan Dilbeny was going to come, but she had a last-minute change in her plans. We also invited the other 2 members of the House. Unfortunately, they couldn't make it, Jamie Herrera Butler and Kathy McMorris. So, but we're happy to have the 2 of you here. We're very excited about it. So, Joni, you want to start off?
One more preamble. Dean Powers did most of this, but I just want to point out to the audience that these 2 members of Congress represent very different congressional districts. And so, you know, their answers will be like that, I think. So I'm going to start with you, Representative Schrier. As everyone's saying here, there's a lot of excitement about the greatly increased number of women in the House. The number we were negotiating, what it was, because there's different ways of counting, 102 female members in the House. It's a record. 25 women now in the U.S. Senate. So, Congresswoman Schrier, you have been in D.C. now for 100 days. So, a fresh observer to the scene. And so far, I guess, what have you noticed? What is the difference in the way that women govern, if they do, differently from men?
First of all, thank you for having us here tonight. And we do come from different districts, but we are buddies and we share the same values. And so, yes, we have different districts, but I think it's really important just first to get this out. The press is trying to paint us as a divided party, and we are not. We are absolutely united in our values.
Wait, the press is bad somehow?
I love the press, and I want a free press, but I understand that you want eyeballs, and so you want conflict, and I mean, really, it's kind of a nothing burger, so I just want to let you all know that. Your question was about, how is it different? How is it different when women are in? I have no idea, because I've only been there when women are there, and what I can tell you is that, what you see on TV when you see the men coming out and like grandstanding and chest thumping and doing all this stuff like they did with the Adam Schiff episode a couple weeks ago, like women don't do that. We collaborate, we make friends on both sides of the aisle, and it's really interesting because in the lead up to the election there were lots of comments, Schrier, she's a woman, she can't beat Dino Rossi, she's too nice, she's just gonna get walked all over in Congress. I heard it all. The bottom line is that women do a really good job because we form alliances and we work together and we problem solve and we just put our heads down and get moving. So I'm delighted to be in that kind of company. I'm hoping more women doctors will come in. So, I mean, it's exciting to be the only, but I'd rather be one of several. And I hope more women come in so we can really represent.
Congresswoman Jayapal, you've been there longer, so you have time to observe what difference women make in the offices.
Yeah, well, it has been fantastic to have this new surge of energy, and it's been so great to have Congresswoman Schrier in our caucus and to increase our number of Democrats in Washington State, and we hope to continue to do that. And I think that, the other big piece of the story here is women of color. We have more women of color now than ever before, which has been really fantastic. But still, we should just know that the number of women over the course of history is still extremely low, and the number of women of color is even lower. So only 72 women of color have ever served in the United States Congress out of over 11,000. So, I think that what I see is that we are finally starting to grapple with the diversity of perspectives that are represented across the country and really understanding that people bring very different sets of experiences, and that allows for people like Kim to bring a doctor's perspective, a woman doctor's perspective. It allows for women of color to bring the perspective like Ayanna Pressley does of being the first African-American woman ever elected out of Massachusetts. It allows me to bring the perspective of being the first Democrat of color ever elected from Washington State to the United States Congress. And I think that that has just been a beautiful, enriching conversation. The energy is incredible of our new class, and I think that there's a lot of excitement that women have brought, and if you saw the State of the Union, you saw that even Trump acknowledged all the women that were there, and I don't think he expected us to take over the chamber like we did, but we certainly took it over, we gave, so that was fantastic.
Not all wearing the same
He should have expected it.
Congresswoman Jayapal, you're mentoring some of these new first-term female representatives. What are you telling them about how to get along with others, especially those who have different views than their own?
Well, I've been surprised at all these stories that have come out. I help and I build relationships with these new members, and when they want my advice, I'll give it to them. But a lot of it is really talking to each other about what it's like, and particularly for some of the women of color. Not all of the women that I have deep relationships with are women of color, but especially for the women of color, there is a discussion about the racism on top of the sexism that we all face as women, and how to navigate some of that, how to decide when you want to take something on, what the consequences are to yourself, to your own soul. If you always have to be taking everything on, how do you decide when it's worth it, when it's not? And then how do you navigate some of the real challenges within Congress? And it's been amazing. I just do little dinners at my house. Sometimes it's box soup, like with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Then you get on Instagram Live and 4,000 people watch you eating box soup. Or sometimes it's really off-the-record conversations that are much, that are deeper and that are about some of the real challenges that we face. And so I don't know that there's necessarily one thing I'm telling people other than don't be patronized, don't be minimized, believe in yourself, and think about what it is you want to achieve, and make sure if you're falling on a sword, make sure it's a sword you want to fall on. Because there are going to be things that you won't be able to do if you fall on a particular sword. And so that's just a strategy question, really, but it also is a soul question. What can you take? When do you have to speak out? When do you decide to be silent?
Congresswoman Schrier, as a freshman, we haven't heard as much about you during your first term. I know you've only been there 100 days. 3 months. 3 months. Is that part of your strategy to maintain a relatively low profile in your first term?
That's such an interesting question. You know, I sat down with my team right at the beginning. One of the first things we talked about is, what do you want in 2 years? What do you want the Seattle Times editorial board to say about you? What do you want people to remember about you? And what do you want to do in terms of media? And Libby here in the front row is my communications director. And I said, you know, I don't need to be out there on CNN and MSNBC. Like, there's lots of good people out there to do that. But if it's something about healthcare, if it's something about women's reproductive rights, if it's something about children, my goodness, if it's about vaccines, like, if it is something. So if it is something where I am the national expert, then I sure as heck better be on CNN, MSNBC, and whatnot. But if it's the everyday stuff, other people can do that, and I will focus on serving my constituents, being on local media, interviewing with newspapers, lower profile, and spending some time learning. You know, that's another thing women do, by the way. We go in and we observe, and we learn before opening our big mouths. And so I have been doing plenty of observing and listening for these first few months.
Representative Schrier, the Democratic Party is moving left, and we heard you today that you get along and all of that, but does that leftward shift represent a problem for you? Because as we were discussing about the 8th district, I mean, that isn't even really a swing district. It has been represented by a Republican since it was founded in 1983.
So we talk about the party going left. But I think the party is really more going to the people. And so it's not like it's a leftist thing. It's really like government is there for a reason. We are a government by the people, for the people, of the people. And so it's our job to really work for the people who elected us. And so when you hear about universal health care, whether it is like a Medicare for all, or whether it is enhancing, shoring up the Affordable Care Act, we're all doing it as Democrats because we want the best thing for our constituents. And so I think I'm going to sort of kind of reject the premise and just say we're working for the people. We're trying to get corruption out of politics. We're trying to get people the health care they deserve. We're trying to get great public education. We're trying to level the playing field so that your ultimate success in life does not depend on your zip code or your parents, and that every child should have a shot at the American dream.
Okay. So Representative Jayapal, you are a co-chair of the House Progressive Caucus. And do you ever worry that some of the things, some of the issues that you promote really sell well here, you know, in the 7th District of Washington, but may actually work against the Democrats who, in all the parts of the country where they're trying to win additional House seats or take back the Senate for themselves or win the presidency?
Well, let me just say, I totally agree with Congresswoman Schrier that we are focused. We ran on a For the People agenda in the last cycle, and we ran on cutting the price of prescription drugs. We ran on getting money out of politics. We ran on a bold infrastructure package, and we are completely united around those things. Now, you know, we believe that many of the issues that we fight for as the Congressional Progressive Caucus, and frankly, we have a lot of crossover. We have a lot of the new Democrats who are considered sort of the next, you know, we have the progressives, we have the new Dems, and we have the blue dogs. So these are ideological caucuses. We're all Democrats. We're all one big family. And there's a lot of overlap with new Dems as well on a lot of our issues. And I think we have to re-examine this left question, just as Kim said, because on issues like Medicare for All. It isn't every swing district that is like this, and I'm certainly not saying that it is, but there are a number of people who are on the Medicare for All bill, who ran on Medicare for All, who won on Medicare for All in districts that have never been held by a Democrat, always held by a Republican. Swing districts that Trump won in some cases. And we probably have about 8 members of Congress who are on the current Medicare for All bill who ran on that premise. So I think the real question here is, does this economy work for people? Does the Republican plan, the tax scam, since we're on April 15th today, 1 year of the Republican tax scam, does it work for the people? Or do you want a party that is about delivering real results for people, reversing the decades of inequality that are in this country, getting money out of politics, passing health care that moves us along the lines? We're all united, by the way, on the Affordable Care Act and shoring up the Affordable Care Act. Every single Democrat that I know is committed to that right now, including me as a sponsor of Medicare for All. So I just think the media likes to have a dialogue that is, and we love you, Joni, and we love the media.
Got it.
You know, I do a lot of media. So, but it is much more interesting to say Democrats are divided. They're fighting with each other. You know, they're going to destroy the chances of winning back the House. No, I got news for you. We're going to keep the House, we're going to win the Senate, and we're going to take the White House.
Congresswoman Jayapal. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi says she supports the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee vow not to do business with any consulting firm that works for candidates mounting primary challenges to incumbents. Where are you in this?
Well, I don't agree with it. And I've said that publicly. I actually tried not to say that publicly for weeks as we were trying to work out a solution behind the scenes. But I just want to explain what this means. It means that if there's a consultant, a political consultant, that has 5 candidates that they're working for, 4 of them are incumbents like me and Kim, and the 5th one is somebody who might be challenging an incumbent, it means that the DCCC, which is a membership organization that we all contribute dues to, cannot give money to that consultant, for example, for my race. That makes no sense to me. What I think we should understand is the DCCC is a membership organization that does support incumbent candidates. It doesn't mean challengers can't run and win, by the way, without the support of the DCCC, as we saw in this last election. But I think we're all fine with the DCCC supporting incumbents, but I don't think that we should use basically an antitrust strategy to stop people from taking on other candidates. And let's just be clear, women of color and people of color in general often are the ones that don't have access to some of the biggest consultants. So those smaller consultants, I think, will disproportionately hurt candidates of color who are trying to run. So I'm not in favor of it. We try to keep it in the family here. We're trying to figure out what to do about this and solve this problem, but we don't want to turn off our base. We don't want to turn off Democratic donors who think that it's basically an undemocratic policy, and we want to make sure that we can reverse it and continue to support our incumbents, but also make sure that we're not playing into antitrust laws, which is what I think the policy does.
Congresswoman Schrier, a part of the success of any election involves appealing to voters outside your natural constituency. One of the key groups that Trump captured were working class white males. How do women, as they celebrate their collective power, win over some of the votes of these white male voters?
I'm formulating ideas. You know, I think that a lot of attention is paid to white working class males. I think a lot is paid to women. And I think we should spend less time breaking up our communities and more time just looking at the whole community, because I think that when it comes to some of the issues that we ran on, like healthcare and education for our kids and the ability to get your foot in the door and own a house, that it doesn't really matter if you're a woman, if you're a coal miner. if you are a doctor, I think it still matters. And I think that if, as a party, we can continue to focus on the American people and not try to just break it up and strategize and like be ourselves, share our values, and work from there, and not just target special groups. We need to win all hearts and minds out there.
So looking ahead, I just wanted to tell folks that if you want to ask a question, we'd like you to write it on a card. Those cards are going to be, will be passed out, and we'll give you a chance to ask the questions that you have, so that we can include you in the conversation toward the end of the conversation. Lindsay's going to start passing those out.
I think that some of them have already
And
gotten
some have been
but
given
if you
out
haven't
as well.
gotten one,
Right.
Lindsay's coming around here to pass
Just in
out more
case you didn't
cards.
get a card, if you have a question, join us. We'd love to have your question as well. So Representative Schrier, as we've said a couple of times here, you are the only female doctor in Congress. You're willing to welcome many more. But anyway, for right now, how does the knowledge that you bring to that affect your constituents on health care? Because that's really what people were thinking about, probably, when they voted for you.
I do believe that is a very big part the reason that I won, that people are worried about their health care, they're worried about affordability and accessibility, and pediatricians as a whole are a very trustworthy group, and just like I've always gone to bat for my patients, people said, please go to Washington, D.C., and don't let all of these people who are not doctors make decisions about our health care and help. And so that is what I have been doing right from the start, and I think having this perspective as a doctor, but also as a patient in this very complicated system, gives me a real appreciation of the complexity, and that the solutions are not going to be super simple ones, and that also that my patients who come to me with insurance premiums that are $1,700 a month and a $10,000 deductible, they also can't wait. And so I am looking with my whole party at ways that we can bring down costs immediately, and I think that's what the perspective of the doctor brings.
And the healthcare situation, one of your supporters, friends, whatever, told me is what motivated you. You got angry about that exact situation, and that's what made you run.
That's so funny. I almost never use the word angry, but
All right.
somebody recently said women should own anger. I usually say frustrated, but yes, you're right. I mean, what happened was that the 2016 election kind of, I think it rocked a lot of our worlds, and I did what a lot of people did with rallying and calling my congressman on a very regular basis, but it was really when they were trying to take health care away from Americans that I went as a doctor to Dave Reichert's office and explained with 3 other doctors how harmful that would be for our patients, for Planned Parenthood, and days later he voted for Trump Care, and it just, together with my dear friend Tracy, we've been friends since I was 2 years old, we put our minds together and said, maybe now's the time for the diabetic pediatrician to go up against the sheriff, because people care about their health care right now.
Congresswoman Jayapal, you mentioned it a little bit earlier. You are a sponsor of Medicare for All. So can you tell us how you will pay for it?
Well, let me turn the question around to you. I'll answer yours. But do you know how much we pay for healthcare costs in this country today? Anybody? I don't want to put Joni on the spot.
No,
Anybody?
It's huge. Oh, it's huge. Let me go out on a limb here.
Let me
It's
just
huge.
tell you, it's $3.9 trillion, going up, according to the Gates Foundation, to over $5 trillion in the next 10 years. So that is anywhere from $32 trillion to $50 trillion that we spend on healthcare costs in this country today. That is about 18.5% of our GDP. That is almost double the cost of what every industrialized country in the world spends on healthcare. And we have, you might think that we have the best outcomes. Anybody think that we might have the best outcomes because we've got such expensive care? No, we have the highest maternal mortality rate, that's moms dying in childbirth. We have the highest infant mortality rates, that's kids dying as babies. And we are the only industrialized country in the world whose life expectancy is going down and not up. So we have 70 million Americans who are uninsured, underinsured, and tens of millions of Americans more who cannot afford their cancer treatments, their insulin treatments, who die every year. Or in some cases, the most recent phenomenon I'm hearing about is people don't get married because if they get married, they can't actually afford the costs of their health care because it changes. So my belief is we have to fix it. We have to fix it. We cannot be the country that ended slavery, gave women the right to vote, and sent a man to the moon and not be able to provide universal health care for every single person in this country. So that is what my Medicare for All bill does. We spent 7 months crafting it. We looked at the current bills that are in the House and the bills that are in the Senate. And our Medicare for All bill, to answer your question, would bring down the costs of health care for this country by trillions of dollars. It would finally impose cost containment on those so many in, the pharmaceutical drug pricing. We'd have the ability to negotiate drugs. But the most important thing is we would take the marketplace of health insurance and it would be covered by the government instead of by for-profit insurance companies that are spending a lot of money on their CEO salaries, but putting profits over patients. And in the end, we don't have an estimate for it but everybody uses different estimates, so I'll just use one of them, $32 trillion, let's say that's true, over 10 years. That's actually cheaper than what people pay. And our estimates are that the insurance costs for the average family would come down by at least 14%. So I think it's a pretty good deal, but it requires the courage to take on a for-profit insurance company
Come down from
industry.
what they're paying now or from what the future is projected to be?
Both, dramatically, because most of the bills that are in Congress today do not address the cost issue. So if we were to there is a pharmaceutical drug pricing bill, several proposals on the table. My bill actually includes Lloyd Doggett's proposal, which says not only would you be required to negotiate the prices of drugs for pharmaceuticals, but you would also have the stick of compulsory licensing, which says that if a name brand pharmaceutical company won't negotiate that drug for use in the Medicare system, then you would actually be able to move to compulsory licensing to a generic so that people could have access to the drugs that, by the way, we pay for in terms of our investments into R&D for pharmaceuticals. So we're super excited. We've got 109 original co-sponsors on the bill, and we've got more labor support than ever before. The disability rights community is totally on board because we finally address long-term care supports and services. And we have a real movement across the country to get to this. We understand we don't control the House, the Senate, and the White House, but we have to do this, people. We cannot allow this healthcare crisis that we have in this country to continue.
Representative Jayapal, I'd like to ask a follow-up to that. South Bend Mayor Pete Buttigieg, also presidential candidate, said yesterday, anyone in politics who lets the words Medicare for all escape their lips also has a responsibility to explain how we could actually get there. To achieve this Medicare for all, what are you going to, will income taxes be raised, or what's your plan?
You're talking about cost again. Everyone always wants to go to cost. We've actually got a plan to put in a whole system that increases the ability it allows people the ability to get vision, dental, all kinds of things. But I'll go to your question because that's really what you want to go to. Okay, so here it is. We pay $3.2 trillion going up to $5 trillion, right? 2/3 of the cost, let's say Medicare for all costs $32 trillion over the next 10 years, that's $3.2 trillion. 2/3 of that cost is already paid for by the federal government because it's Medicaid, Medicare spending, and premiums, subsidies for people who get health care, all right? So 2/3 we're already paying, we're gonna keep paying it, but into this new program. What about the remaining third? Let's say if it's $3.2 trillion, that's about $1 trillion a year. By the way, the Republican tax scam was $1.5 trillion, just saying. But in addition to the cost that the federal government pays, about $700 billion gets paid by employers for insurance premiums for their employees. So if you just took a portion of that, let's say you took about $500 billion, that employers would pay now to the federal government in the form of a payroll tax, for example. They would still be paying less. And then you could raise taxes on the very wealthiest to come up with that last $500 billion. Nobody ever asks how you pay for things when it's tax cuts for the wealthiest. Nobody ever asks. Nobody talked about it during the tax scam. Nobody talks about it when we talk about putting $733 billion into defense spending. So how about we invest a little bit into the health care of every American? Seems reasonable to me.
So coming at this from a different side, Representative Schrier, the polls I'm reading, and a lot of polls show that most Americans, this is kind of a conundrum because there's a lot of problems with health care, but the folks who have it, the 179 million Americans who have it, actually like the plans they have. So is it a mistake to push Medicare for all if people are kind of comfortable with what they have? Maybe it's fear. Maybe that's what's operating here. That's a possibility.
Thank you for that question. So first of all, I would just like to say, although we may have a little bit different views on how to get there, we have one political party that wants to make healthcare accessible and affordable and make sure everybody is covered and nobody goes bankrupt because of medical expenses. And we have another party that wants to save money and throw everybody under the bus. So let's first just be clear about the big distinction here. It is true that a lot of people really like what they have. And certainly in my conversations with people all over the 8th District, people who have insurance through their employer, they like it, and they worry if you ask the question, do you want Medicare for all, you'll get a big number, like 70% of the population will say yes. But if you really kind of dive deeper and you say, are you ready to give up the insurance that you have now for Medicare, that number goes down into the low 20s. And what that conveys is,
So
yes,
it is kind of a,
people like what they have.
I'm reserving a point of order, just
sounds like it. Okay.
The gentle lady reserves a point of order. So people do like what they have. And so if the ultimate goal is to get people covered in a way that they have the coverage they need, but they can afford, and we know that we have a big part of the population that's already taken care of by Medicaid and by Medicare, then and by their employers, then what we have is a real need to help those people who have not been helped by the subsidies because their income is just too high to really benefit. Those are the ones who are really feeling the squeeze. And that is why, we could resolve some of these pains tomorrow. And that's what we have already proposed, is extending those subsidies up to 600% of the poverty level, and currently they're at 400%, making sure that no family pays more than 8.5% of their income on healthcare premiums. And these are real, this is not like a little 10% difference. This is a big difference. It means that in my district, a family of 4 earning about $100,000 a year would have their rates cut in half. And that is a real, meaningful, palpable difference that could happen right away without an overhaul of the system. And in my conversations with the people who sent me to Congress, that's what they're looking for. And of course, I have to go on and just mention prescription drug prices. One of the big issues that we have, if you really dig into the weeds here, is that Medicaid is obliged to cover every FDA-approved medication out there, as is Medicare, which means there is no room for negotiating right now, and that is just appalling. It puts all of the power in the hands of the drug companies, and that is why we are having hearings on prescription drug pricing. It is why last week we did hearings on insulin pricing, which has gone up. My own insulin in the past 10 years has tripled in price, and in 20 years went from $40 a bottle up to $260 a bottle now. So we need those kinds of price containments, and so that's the tack that I'm taking. What can we do today that will take pain away from people immediately and leave people with health care that they can afford?
I just wanted to agree 150% on prescription drug pricing. The VA pays 80% less than Medicare does for prescription drugs. And that's because the VA has the ability to negotiate drug pricing, but Medicare does not. And that's a huge, huge, huge problem. I just wanted to correct a couple of things just in terms of the polling. So because obviously I've been diving into this for 7 months, and so we've looked very deeply at the polling on Medicare for All, and we're about to do another big poll in 32 swing districts across the country on this topic. But the reason that people say, the reason the numbers, Kim's absolutely right, the numbers go down. I don't know that it's quite down to 20%, but it goes down when you ask people if they want to get off their insurance plans. The reason is they think that when you get off your insurance plan, you're not going to be able to see the same doctor or hospital. They think that it means that the government would take over the provision of health care. And so once you tell them that no, actually getting rid of your insurance plan just means you don't have to pay an insurance premium to a for-profit insurance company, then they're fine as long as they know they get to see their same doctor or hospital, because our Medicare for All plan wouldn't change the delivery system. In fact, you would have more choice of doctors and hospitals because you wouldn't go to, there wouldn't be an in-network or out-of-network doctor or hospital. So, you know, I think that there are some nuances here to the conversation, and most people want to go straight to the cost question without really understanding what the deep cost of our healthcare system is today and what it costs us to die or to wake up not knowing if we're going to be able to pay our mortgage or take our health insurance treatment or not get our cancer treatment or drive to Canada. And so that's, I think we have to just reset the conversation around costs, but also around what kind of a country do we want to be. And do we want to be like every other industrialized country in the world that actually provides universal health care for everyone? And I think the answer is that people do believe that, and it's going to take a lot to get there.
Oh, I'm doing it. I'm doing it. Okay. Representative Schrier, you haven't been that quiet. You were on the front of the New York Times, quoted recently, and you said, we were talking about just the same stuff. We have very practical solutions that we can implement immediately, as you mentioned a few minutes ago. We don't have the luxury of time right now to wait for a full overhaul of our healthcare system. So what are the practical first steps if it was able to be accomplished?
Sure. Well, some of those first steps are what we just talked about. Nobody pays more than 8.5% of their income on health care. Another one is that if you really think about it, it doesn't matter who is paying if the costs are too high. And so addressing the cost of prescription drugs is critical. We also need to think about how we use those funds. And this is where a pediatrician comes in, right? That there are trade-offs everywhere. And if we can invest in things like immunizations and preventative care, I think one of the ideas that I would love to see as we shore up the Affordable Care Act is that in my experience, a lot of parents, even if they have insurance, they will delay coming in to see me because they know they have a high deductible and it's going to cost them whatever, how much it costs, maybe, I don't know, $200 to go and see the doctor. And that's a ton of money. And so you try to just work it out at home. And that ultimately can lead to really bad consequences because people get sicker and sicker. And I believe that as we kind of shore up the Affordable Care Act, one of the things we should do is say, for example, you know, the first 5 outpatient visits and the first 1 ER visit, those are going to be freebies. We're not going to charge those against your deductible because we don't want people sitting at home with a child with 106-degree fever going, well, maybe he'll be okay. No parent should ever be put in that situation. And so there are ways that we can do this that will help people and actually allow them to access care that they are insured for without having that barrier to care.
We're going to have a few more questions, but Lindsay, could you start collecting people's questions from the audience? Representative Jayapal, we read in Bloomberg that you're not, at this point, endorsing any of the presidential candidate, Democratic presidential candidates. And we're wondering, are there any issues that would cause you to rule out a candidate if they didn't support, say, for Medicare for All?
No, I mean, I think that because I'm the co-chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus and we have 98 members that are part of the CPC, I feel like it's important for me to just keep my powder a little bit dry. We're going to try to have any candidates that want to come in and talk to Progressive Caucus members be able to come in. We'll do some sort of a set of forums around that. And so I think I am looking for a candidate. It's less about the issues and more about the willingness to tackle some of the toughest challenges that we have in this country, one of which for me is income inequality. We have 3 people in the country today, 2 of whom live in our state, who have the same wealth as the bottom 50% of people. And the top 10th of the percentile of Americans in this country own as much wealth as 90% of Americans in this country. We are at the highest levels of inequality since the 1920s. So we are going to have to take on the wealthiest corporations, the wealthiest individuals who are lobbying Congress. We need to get money out of politics, and we have to be brave enough to do that. And that's what I'm looking for in a candidate. And I'm also looking for a candidate who really understands the intersection between race, class, and gender, and will address the deep structural inequalities of racism, sexism, and all the other isms, and will stand up for people who are most vulnerable, including, you know, stand up against Islamophobia and anti-Semitism and all the other isms that are out there. So that's what I'm looking for, and I think it's great that we have all these great candidates, because each one gets to bring up something slightly different, and we get to have a real conversation about the issues that matter.
Representative Schrier, the same question for you. Have you endorsed a candidate? And if you haven't, are there any issues that would cause you to rule out a candidate?
I have not endorsed anybody, and I'm not going to make any headlines tonight. I am staying out of this one. You know, what I would say is that I agree with my colleague, Representative Jayapal, because all of those issues are very much part of what we Democrats care about, is leveling that playing field, helping the middle class, having a livable wage, great public education, all of those things. And the great thing is that every one of the candidates on the D side believes those same things. They have those same values. And so I just think we have this embarrassment of riches, and I'm excited to support whoever the people decide is the best candidate. And I would just ask all of you, we have a tendency to tear each other down in primaries. I went through it. A lot of people go through it. And I would just ask, you know, there's, I believe 18 people running right now, if my numbers are updated. Pick your candidate, pick who you love, donate money, volunteer, talk them up, do whatever you need to do, and then let this primary play out. And you've got a 17 out of 18 chance that your person is not gonna win. And then you gotta really quickly just lick your wounds, move on, and all band together and support the candidate who emerges from this primary. Because we, at this moment in our history, we got to be united. The future of our democracy is at risk.
Representative Schrier, we'd like to get your views of the Green New Deal. It's been a subject that some Democrats or some Republicans have widely ridiculed. What's your view of it?
Okay, so first of all, they ought to be ridiculed for ridiculing progress on clean energy and taking care of our planet. This is all ass backwards. Thank goodness that we are talking about clean energy and climate change, because this is a critical issue. We've got the clock is ticking. We've got 11 years to get this under control. And Congress has been dragging its feet because the other side has been in the majority. They are climate deniers. We have a president who does not believe this is happening. And meanwhile, it's our kids and grandkids and generations that we will never know who are going to have to suffer the consequences. And frankly, in case you haven't noticed, we're already suffering the consequences. And so I would just say, thank goodness we're talking about this. Thank goodness scientists are in Congress now, and I'm one of them, evidence-based policies. And thank goodness now we're no longer putting scientists on trial. We're actually doing hearings to hear what the scientists have to say so that we can come up with the best policies to address this crisis. And so as we are talking about a comprehensive infrastructure package, let me assure you that the New Dems are in support of having a green angle on everything in that package, whether it is incentivizing battery storage, a new modernized nimble electrical grid, whether it is wind or solar, whether it is carbon capture, or even I'm on the agriculture committee, we can do a heck of a lot with regenerative farming to have a carbon sink or a sequester carbon into the soil with no-till farming. So this is an all of the above, and I am just so relieved that finally we are taking this most important issue seriously.
Representative Jayapal, imagine you watched the 60 Minutes interview last night with House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, and one of the sentences she said was, "I do reject socialism as an economic system." So, is there room for socialist candidates and socialism in the Democratic Party?
Well, Democrats, there are a wide view of things, and people have been calling ideas socialist for as long as we can remember. Harry Truman was called socialist for proposing Medicare. You could say that our farm subsidies are socialist because they come from the government. So the question is, like, what does socialism really mean? And to me, the question of a government providing a service for a particular critical need should not be called socialism. Medicare is that. Social Security is that, though Social Security has taxes that are paid in. It's an earned benefit. And so for me, I think of common goodism, and I think that that's where we really should be thinking, is how do we provide, how does a government provide the most for the people, for all of the people? And I think that's really what that's really what we're all about. That's what the Democratic Party is about. And I do think we have to address the fact that the system we have now, different people have talked about it in different ways, but capitalism without any limits to it is also not going to benefit us. And so how do we really build a system of economics that benefits regular working people? Or do you have to be wealthy in order to get any benefit? That isn't what we're about either. So I'm all about common goodism. I might have to use that phrase when people ask me about socialism and capitalism and just say common goodism. That's what we're about.
Oh, there you go. Representative Schrier, I wanted to quote Steve Bannon. I think this is possibly the first time in my life I've quoted Steve Bannon, but anyway, he said, the more Democrats focus on identity politics, the better it is for Republicans and Donald Trump. Do you think Democrats talk too much about identity politics?
I don't think so. And I believe that while we need to be mindful of all the different groups and unique needs, I think we can make major strides by focusing on the American people. And I believe that the agenda that we're pursuing right now doesn't need to call out any special groups, because I believe all of these groups would like to see a level playing field and equality and fairness and great public education. So I don't know if he's right or wrong, but I can tell you that as I'm talking, I do not talk identity politics. I talk about the people in my district.
I'm getting the sense that Representative Jayapal wants to...
Oh, can I, before you jump in, because you may have something different to say, capitalist who believes in a strong safety net, and I would agree that capitalism unchecked is what has led to this huge gap between the haves and the have-nots, and that is why we need to do things like a livable wage and supporting unions and making sure that working people continue to have a say, because capitalism unchecked is a dangerous thing.
Identity politics. I don't agree with anything Steve Bannon says. I mean, I just don't. He is a dangerous, dangerous man who is associated with white supremacists and white nationalists and has gotten too big of a stage for those ideas, including from the White House. I don't know what identity politics is. Is it identity politics for me as an Indian American woman to talk about what it means for me to have come to this country as a 16-year-old immigrant and the struggles I've faced? Is it identity politics to talk about how our institutions in this country, including going back to slavery and the taking of land from Native American people, is part of the history that we have to reverse and acknowledge and talk about and do something about? Or is it identity politics to talk about the rural white folks who have gotten a bad deal from this White House and Republicans? to me, our identity is core to who we are. And the beauty of this country is that we have many identities, but some have been disproportionately affected by the policies we've had in place. So to me, it's always a false choice to say, you know, working class and then often white is understood versus identity politics. That's not what this is about. Everybody in America, white, black, and brown, is getting a bad deal from Republicans in the White House. And we have to recognize that, talk about that, not run away from the questions of race that are so deep and central to this country taking on a history that was not always beautiful and a vision that is beautiful. And if we want to get to that vision, we have to address some of the deep hurts and wrongs of this country and the structures that still basically work to that end.
Okay, now we're going to make a shift and ask some of the questions that you provided us. And the first question comes from an MPA class. Diversity and Inclusion is here tonight. So they have a question, or one of the students has a question of you, Congresswoman Schrier. I've been greatly inspired in the last few years by everyday citizens, especially women, who decided to run for public office with little or no previous political experience. What inspired you to make the leap from healthcare to politics? And what advice do you have for those of us with no political experience who may want to run for office in the future?
Asking the newbie. That probably was written before I gave my answer about meeting with Dave Reichert. And it was really, I mean, it is the most rash thing I've ever done, probably the most courageous thing I've ever done too, because I never in a million years saw myself in politics. And I think that's the same of so many women who ran this year. Like, the election happened, we said, oh my gosh, what's going on in our country? I can't trust anybody else to do this. It's time to roll up my sleeves and get involved. And I hope that a moment like that does not come again, that will inspire people to make that leap. But here I will tell you one more thing. You know, along the way, people said, you know, why pediatrician? You know, what do you have to offer? And I would say, you know, our House of Representatives should be representative. Like, we shouldn't all be politicians, we shouldn't all be lawyers, and that there is a room for a lot of different voices, different backgrounds. And that's why I'm so proud of this most diverse class in so many ways. And I would say, if you have something that you are expert in, that you think the government is failing at, then you should run for office. And if you're a woman, don't wait for somebody to ask you 7 times. Just go for it. The men are not waiting 7 times. They just jump right in.
Congresswoman Jayapal, happy Vishnu. You mentioned taking back the Senate despite the Democratic Party's leftward shift. Considering the increase in polarization and the red-leaning nature of more states, plus the trend of decreasing red state Democrats and the current 53-47 split in the Senate, which Republican incumbents do you see being unseated in 2020 and or 2022?
I mean, I think that there are a number of states that we came very close in last time. I think about Texas. I think about Georgia. I think about, you know, there are a number of places across the country where I think people are, they don't, you know, they want to have a check on a country that seems too out of control on a lot of basic core values. And so rather than talking about specific states, I think we can look at the map from last time around and realize that obviously this time we're going to have different Senate races, but those were places where somebody ran for governor could certainly challenge a Senate candidate, right? So Andrew Gillum, I think, would be a really interesting person to run. Stacey Abrams would be a really interesting person to run if she doesn't run for president, which she still might do. And so I think there's a lot of different places. I will say it's a hard map. It's not an easy map, but it's a better map than last time. So I think we have a real potential, and women are going to be at the center, front and center of that. You know, women across the country who are looking and saying, we cannot take this anymore. And that was what helped us last time. It was young people, it was women, it was folks of color. We finally moved from the myth of the likely voter to the truth of every voter. I know in the 7th district we had a ton of my volunteers out in the 8th district helping to knock on doors because they knew that we had to get everybody. And by the end of Kim's campaign, she had knocked on so many doors that people were like, no more, no more. That's always a good sign as a candidate.
It was Halloween at that time,
That's always
too.
a good sign as a candidate if people are sick of seeing you at their door, right? So.
I'll say thank you for that. And I would agree with a lot of what you said. It really depends on the candidate that we put up and how much they relate to people and what message they deliver. And what do we say? We have 18 people running for president right now on our side. And that means 17 of them are not going to win the nomination. And in there are some pretty phenomenal candidates who could run for Senate and win handily. So have faith, all.
So this question would have you sort of analyzing something that happened in the Senate, but bear with me here. If the Green New Deal is such a crucial piece of legislation that should be implemented as soon as possible, why did the Democrats refuse to vote on it in the Senate? Instead, they voted, as you all know, present.
Okay, so let me just break some news to you. That was a question for me?
Yep.
It was not a piece of legislation. It never was one. It's a value statement. And so I think if it had been a piece of legislation that had said, we want to put this kind of money, we want to take subsidies away from the fossil fuel industry, we want to invest in research and development, we want to rebuild our infrastructure in a green way, heck yeah, that would have made it to the floor. But it was a value statement. It had some tricky wording, and at one point in its development, it had a comment about a universal basic income even for people who don't want to work. And that phrase would have been taken and stuck onto anybody running on that. So there were many reasons it was problematic, but mostly because it wasn't going to actually do anything other than state values.
You want me to answer that? You're looking at me like you want me to answer
No, only if
that?
I was looking at you to see if you wanted to answer that. It was all about that.
Well, I would just say that, it was a gotcha vote. It wasn't a real discussion or debate. I mean, they had no interest in having a hearing on it and actually talking about the content of what was in it. It was just a gotcha vote. And those gotcha votes are not helpful because you're not moving any policy idea forward, and you're just sort of, it's being put up there by the Republicans. And so this is something that they do a lot. Democrats don't tend to do this, but Republicans do this a lot, where they will put up a bill without a hearing, without a debate, without anything, and then use it as a gotcha vote before there's ever been a discussion on it. And that's not how legislation is crafted at all. So
Representative Jayapal, as a woman of color in Congress, what is a challenge you have faced that you were unsure how to approach, and how did you overcome it?
Well, what was that? Somebody's giving me an answer? Yeah, I know, really. I work too hard. No. Anytime I do an interview, I say to people, do not tell me you work too hard. You definitely won't get the job. I think it's just, and this happens for all women, I think, but it happens more for women of color. It's another overlay of people, treating you like you're too young or you don't know something or being disrespectful. And so I've had a couple of really fun incidents where the most fun and probably the one that went the most viral was when Don Young, Republican from Alaska, I was on the House floor. I was actually debating an environmental proposal that he had to allow predatory hunting on federal lands in Alaska. And I got up to claim time in opposition to his amendment, and he went off on me and said, young lady, you don't know a damn thing about what you're talking about. And so I demanded that he take down his words, which I I didn't know what that really meant, but I had heard during my orientation that that was what you were supposed to do if somebody insulted you on the floor. And so I did, and what it does is it stops the whole operation of the House floor. And then the parliamentarian goes back and they review the words, and if the person has really insulted you and defied the rules of the House floor, which he had by addressing something directly to me and then being insulting towards me, then you can ask for them to be censured and they can't speak for the rest of the night. And it was his amendment.
Oh,
And so,
I didn't know.
so when I said I demand that the gentleman take down his words, and the whole floor comes to a halt, and I'm thinking to myself, I have no idea what's happening next, but I'm just going to stand here. And then the majority, Ryan's floor leader, comes running out to me and he says, Representative Jayapal, I'm so sorry. He shouldn't have said that. Would you accept if he just struck his words from the record? And I said, I would like an apology, and a public apology. And he looks at me and he says, well, I don't think you understand. It's Don Young. And I said, well, I don't think you understand. I'm Pramila Jayapal. And so, needless to say, I got a public apology from Don Young, and it was just a great lesson on, just stand strong, and you don't have to be minimized, you don't have to be patronized, and we as women, and we as women of color, can stand up to things that have been acceptable in the past, but they are not acceptable, and we don't have to stand for it, so.
I want to interject one of my own questions to you, Representative Schrier. So the women of the Senate, I don't know how well this is known, but the women of the Senate for years, Democrats and Republicans, and it's a smaller group of people, obviously 25 to 102, but they meet privately once a month, sometimes it's every other month, without staff. And so they've really gotten to know each other. Now I know it would be more unwieldy to do this in the House, but what do you think of that idea, Representative Schrier, for the women of the House, both parties, no staff, getting together to kind of, and maybe they already do this, and I don't know about it, but what do you think of that as an idea for sort of helping people work together better?
I love that idea. One of my great disappointments has been that our days are so packed and so crowded that the rooms are all set up so that there are Democrats on one side of the room and Republicans on the other side of the room. It does not invite collaboration and working across the aisle. You have to make a very specific effort. And so the notion of having all of the women, or even just a randomly picked 20 people or 10 people at a time to go out somewhere into a room without staffers and just sit down and have a conversation sounds delightful. I've done it on a small...
So delightful that you'll initiate it?
Sure, absolutely. But in that spirit, I, right at the beginning, went out to dinner with Kathy Morris-Rogers and with Dan Newhouse, and I was not the candidate that they wanted to win, but they have been incredibly gracious. We are connecting on a person-to-person level, and I believe that's how it gets done, that you start within your delegation and you start working together, and while you may not agree on a lot of things, you find the places where you do agree. And Dan Newhouse and I came together on this lands package, and we got the Yakima Basin plan through with that lands package that will now provide water resources for Central Washington for the foreseeable future. And that's a big win that only happened because we had dinner together and we worked on that together.
Okay, I've got a related question. I'll direct this.
Can I just say something quick on that too? I do think that there are these opportunities. The big things are much harder, but there are these opportunities on smaller issues. Opioids is another one.
Of course.
And last session, I worked with Mike Johnson from Louisiana, Republican, to pass a major investment in the Law Enforcement Assisted Diversion Program, which started here in Seattle, but has been really great for communities that are facing opioid devastation, to help people get off the streets and get supportive care. And we were able to get that in and passed with significant resources, both through the House and the Senate, and signed by the President. It was part of the appropriations bill. And so sometimes the work that we do together gets much less attention than the work that we do against each other, or for our people, is how we like to think about it, but for the people. But I think that there are those opportunities, and you'd be surprised at some of the calls that I get and take from very, very high-profile Republicans on the other side who want to talk through something.
I've always heard that the airplanes, since you guys have to travel so much, is a good place to do that, some of that work.
I hate doing work on I hate that time on the airplane to talk to.
Oh.
I love seeing Kim, and I love seeing everybody and saying hi and saying one nice thing, and then I'm like, okay.
You're into the movies. You're on the screen.
Congresswoman Jayapal, how do you as women in Congress use social media to present your views, but also interact with those who disagree with you, even lambast you?
I use social media really to communicate with people because so many people communicate that way. And we have, it used to be considered a big Twitter following, not anymore after our new members came in. But it's a really important way to get to a lot of people. I get some horrible, horrible things. Death, people saying really horrendous things. And so I just don't pay attention to those. If there are people who have, and this happened to me, somebody on Facebook said, actually it was on Twitter, somebody said, you said something terrible about Paul Allen, and I just happened to be looking at my Twitter account, and I tweeted back at her and said, I said, here's my statement on Paul Allen. I never said anything terrible about Paul Allen. This was after he died. And she said, oh, I'm so sorry. I thought you were Shama Sawant. And so this is what I get, right? Because we're both Indian women. And so sometimes it's good to say something back when you see something that isn't true, and I will. But really horrible comments that have nothing to do with any reality, I just refuse to deign to answer.
Congresswoman Schrier, how do you use social media?
As little as possible. Boy, I think Twitter gets us in a lot of trouble, and we should all just think before we type. Primarily, I use social media to convey, and I was instructed, and I think this is brilliant, all through the campaign, and now I look at no comments. So those of you who are out there commenting or sending me nasty things, I don't even know, and it helps me get through life really well. Yeah, I don't read the comments, and I let my constituents know what I'm doing and how I'm going to bat for them.
Well, thank you very much for attending tonight. I hope that, thank you, both of you, for kindly giving us your time.
So much time. Thank you so much.